You get people who are willing and who are attracted by the easy path to wealth and riches and influence. But really the target is reducing white male employment, allowing this ANC-controlled government to continue with its transformation agenda and ruin this country. Ownership has to be transferred to black people, a majority ownership, and the majority of employees and management and so on has to be black. This is the policy of the South African government. And I think, unfortunately, some of what we see from the ANC is sincerely just wrong economics. And, much of the collapse, state failure of the last 20 years really has to do with that.
Piet le Roux, it is an absolute pleasure to host you here at Northwood's House, the headquarters of the Free Market Foundation. This building was built in 1904, and we are very privileged to have our offices here, and we're equally privileged to have you visit us today for what I hope will be an insightful conversation about the current situation in South Africa, the business environment, the diplomatic context in which we're operating, and also how we respond to an increasingly aggressive state that is overreaching, is overbloated, is failing in many respects, but it is also rapidly expanding its scope with very damaging effects for individuals, communities, and businesses in this country. So I wanted to start the conversation just by focusing on one of the key elements in your work, which is Black economic empowerment. It sounds very nice, empowering Black South Africans, but that is misleading. It's, I would argue, one of the most dangerous policy paradigms that we have in South Africa. Very insidiously affects almost every aspect of our economic lives in this country. Speak to me about the work that Sakeliga is doing in resisting BEE, but before you do that, also help our audience to understand just exactly how BEE is structured in the current context.
Yes, David, Black economic empowerment is a government term for a very harmful policy. And in its best formulation, in its best understanding, Black economic empowerment is about creating flourishing Black communities. It has not achieved that, and it has been pursued to the detriment of Black communities and also to everybody else in the country. Black economic empowerment, we've identified, came in three waves, you could say. The first dates back right to 1994. And when the ANC entered government, it was really very early on that they started introducing what was called Black economic empowerment or empowerment deals at the time. It wasn't a legislated period, and it also came on the back of an impressive freeing up of the economy. The apartheid restrictions, most of them, virtually all of those restrictions were removed by 1994. And so we're at the low point of race-based restrictions in the economy in South Africa. And as you could expect, this opens up massive opportunities for business and economic interaction across community lines, unprecedented in the history of this country. And that leads to lots of economic growth. It's a flourishing time in many respects. It has its strains, but it's doing well. But you also have lots of goodwill among people who now can freely associate before they couldn't. And I think many companies, white-owned or black-owned at that time, just sought to do business together, and you see transactions happening, some of them with merit and some of them without merit. But you have some political pressure also ramping up, and some people become fabulously wealthy in this unlegislated but combined period of economic opening up with political pressure. People like Cyril Ramaphosa becomes fabulously wealthy in this period. This changes. The second wave comes about in around the early 2000s with two acts. So where we had in the 90s a non-legislated, non-statutory phase, you could say that BEE really enters a statutory phase in the early 2000s with the Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2002-3 and the Procurement Framework Act of around the same time. And that makes BEE a requirement for doing government to private sector contracting. And it has some chain reactions because it has a supply chain scorecard tie-in. And so for the next basically 15 years after that, 10, 15, 20 years, you have a period where the ability to contract with the state becomes subject to the race of the companies doing business. And it sounds great because this empowerment term, this transformation term keeps coming up. But in fact, what you're doing is you're prioritizing the company instead of the recipient of the service or the good that must be procured and provided. So it's an inversion of the order of preference. And so some people, again, become fabulously wealthy. But goods and services, the quality deteriorate, the pool of suppliers contract. And it really distorts the whole economic supply chain into government. And much of the collapse, state failure of the last 20 years really has to do with that. Not only, but that's a major explanation. Then we're now what we call in the third wave of BEE. This starts in around 2018. The first of the legislation that changed to bring us to the third wave was the Competition Act. When in 2018 a clause was introduced that said it in the public interest, the Competition Commission can now use the racial composition or the historically disadvantaged composition or the ownership and the employment and so on of companies to prohibit or allow or set conditions on deals, mergers, acquisitions, debt financing and so on. And we've seen many iterations subsequent in aviation, in telecommunications. Starlink is an example, but all over right through the economy. We're now in the third wave of BEE where, contrary to the second wave where the government contracting relationship was subjected to BEE, in this third wave, just participating in the economy as a business, licensing to enter and to do economic activity, doing normal business-to-business transactions are becoming subject to BEE. So we're basically in this today in South Africa in an accelerating phase of race-based economic licensing, race-based economic access control. That's the short version of where BEE has brought us, and sounds great, but it's very harmful and we must stop it.
Yeah, and I think a useful lens with which to view something like BEE is the politicization of the economy. In previous conversations, you and I have often spoken about the relationship between government and business. And I think business has often gone along to get along with a policy like BEE. It wants to show its goodwill towards the government, wants to genuinely and sincerely, I think, empower Black South Africans and include Black South Africans meaningfully in the economy. But how that's played out is actually in increasing levels of political control over private organizations or corporations. So many of these JSE-listed firms have an ANC cadre on their board.
Yes.
And I think the mistake they often make is, well, having a politically exposed person on our board gives us an opportunity to influence and to lobby and to show the political class about the importance of the private sector and what it contributes to the economy. But actually what happens is the reverse, that it enables political influence to insert itself within the boardroom, and it compels companies to start towing the line in terms of the prevailing political power in this country.
Yes, I'm afraid as much as there are, of course, companies who do very well, even those with a man from Pretoria on their board, but the BEE has distorted, and it's we must look beyond skin color here. Just because some black people are on the boards of some companies, it doesn't mean that circle isn't actually quite small. Professor William Gumede recently wrote an article last week or so where he pointed out how small this circle of just a few hundred people actually are who've benefited so massively from these deals, and I mean their family connections aren't that large. So yes, it does go right through into local municipal level, but really the people who profited most is not such a big circle. And so while it may look like transformation or it may look like black economic empowerment, it is it's a special kind of person, and you get this in all communities, all civilizations, all cultural groups. You get people who are willing and who are attracted by the easy path to wealth and riches and influence, and some say the worst rise to the top. Because the entrepreneurial path is a hard way, and it's much more easy to lobby for a position and a handout or a transaction. And I'm afraid that sometimes skin color obscures just how small the patronage network actually is.
Yeah, so I suppose another way of thinking of your three waves of BEE is that it moved from being a vertical application of BEE, the state and the private sector and that relationship.
Yes.
But now the state is forcing a horizontal application of BEE between private entities.
Yes.
And I think, one of the, I mentioned that term insidious ways in which it does that is it affects an entire supply chain, because if you're at the apex of the supply chain and you're the interface with the state, you then impose these requirements all the way down through your suppliers. And so if you want to do business with the big guys, and the big guys are in bed with government, then you have to abide by those restrictions.
I think insidious is a good word. Now, I would say I would even use the word totalitarian. Not easily so, because it may sound like a word that distracts, but I think it accurately, if we just clinically use the word totalitarian, it actually reveals what's going on.
It's total.
It's a total extension of the state elite and their vision for society into every subsection, and not every subsection of the state, every section of society. It actually sees all elements of society as a subsection of the state. We see this with Black economic empowerment and this horizontal application, where we're making normal business-to-business interactions, participation in the economy, subject to a BEE precondition. But we also see this in something that has not caught the international attention enough yet. It's bound to do so in the next few months, I would say, which is the Employment Equity Amendment Act and the regulations published about 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago. These new employment equity regulations prescribe very strict quotas for especially white male employment. There are other dimensions to this as well, but really the target is reducing white male employment. Now, it's not that the white male employment should be restricted in the aggregate. Same with BEE. It's not like black ownership should be targeted or striven for in the aggregate. It is the government's intention and their program of action to apply this to every company, to every sphere of society, even to non-profits. And so any company now with 50 or more employees from September in this country, South Africa, they will have to mimic the racial demographics of the state as prescribed in these quotas by the minister. So the point here is why I call it totalitarian is because it's extending the state ideology into the homes, the non-profits, the churches, the businesses, actually the fiber of society. And I think that's why it's insidious, but a stronger and more accurate word, I think, would be totalitarian.
Yeah, and the international pressure has been growing, particularly from the United States. And as we were recording this today, a couple of weeks ago, there was an altercation in the White House, in the Oval Office, between President Ramaphosa and President Trump. And yeah, lots of fireworks and noise, mostly around issues of rural security. But if you go back to February, to the executive order that was released by the White House, they listed a number of other things, including the degradation of private property rights, as well as the increase in race-based laws and South Africa's diplomatic posture as well.
Yes.
And, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Employment Equity Amendment Act and some of these more totalitarian measures start to gain the attention of the White House as well. I think in my conversation with your colleague Russell Lamberti, which we'll link to in the description, we spoke quite at length about the opportunity that has arisen from this adverse attention that the White House is giving to South Africa, and that many commentators in South Africa, amongst the media and academia and the commentariat more broadly, have seen this as some kind of threat to our sovereignty or an affront to our nationhood. But actually, this is a massive opportunity for leverage. And if you consider the current landscape, we have a GNU which has, to some extent, nullified the once strong opposition. Perhaps it can exercise some leverage within the government, but it has various constraints. We have a court system which is often quite hostile to some of the principles that we espouse in our respective organizations, and also a media establishment that is very much biased. So this international pressure is really critical. But how do we translate some of these recent events into tangible reforms on the ground here and changes to things like BEE, which seem to be a giant edifice, which is very hard to dismantle?
I think by explaining and raising the awareness about the extent of the race-based restrictions, making it known, making it also relevant to how this applies not only to the US companies, but also to European and countries from other companies. I've spoken to Southeast Asian diplomatic officials who are very concerned about BEE restrictions on airlines. This has been, the BEE requirements have been sent, BEE letters of demand, you could call, have been sent to international airlines. So it affects, yes, the US, but also other countries around the world. So I think but it's hard to understand what's actually going on here from outside. Your organization and some of your colleagues have done extensive work trying to collate all the various laws that reference race. At Sakeliga, we focus more narrowly on BEE and employment equity and some of these laws. And we spend a lot of time figuring out what they mean. And I don't think it's quite appreciated internationally yet, even with companies who are operating here, those trying to make heads or tails from the new requirements. So one way in which we could direct, but also just inform international pressure is by just keeping doing the good work and establishing trusted relationships by providing accurate and clinical, non-emotional information about the actual meaning of these laws. And I think that at least where this affects business, where it's a moral question, it's more difficult. But where it affects business and where it affects international companies, then I think that's a good focus point for constructive international engagement and encouraging constructive international engagement. And with constructive, I don't mean having cordial relationships between government officials. I mean actually having very frank discussions. And if you're not going to do this, then we're going to do this. Hard international diplomatic pressure is to be welcomed. It may be discomforting and it's certainly can be disruptive, but it's much better than the alternative, which is allowing these laws to continue, allowing this ANC-controlled government to continue with its transformation agenda and ruin this country. We have a bit of runway left, but we're on the road to ruin.
Yeah, and there's a lot worth preserving in South Africa, which I think informs the fight that we engage in. So, I mean, I thought it was very interesting to see in the wake of this altercation in the Oval Office that President Ramaphosa then promptly returned to South Africa and appeared in Parliament answering a parliamentary question put to him, I think, by the Freedom Front Plus around the potential for ending BEE in South Africa. I think very good question. And he seemed to double down on the policy. Do you think he is sincere in his belief in BEE as an instrument of economic advantage or opportunity generation, or do you think he knows the kind of the sinister underbelly of it?
It was remarkable when in Parliament he said that he's baffled by the suggestion that BEE is harmful to the economy. And he actually used the word baffled. Some people have since said or argued that that is insincere, that he must know that BEE is harmful. But I actually think that he means it. And I think for three reasons. The one is that he has a preference, and within the ANC and with sections of South African society, there's a hard political preference for a certain kind of political dominance by the ANC and dominance by black people. That is a real political preference with Mr. Ramaphosa and with others. You'll see this in the way he speaks about our people. And that doesn't mean that he dislikes white people or that he's a hardline aggressor or anything like that. But he has a strong preference, and his party has a preference. And I think we must just understand that that is real, and whether we like it or not, that is the way his party approaches it. Now, of course, he presents this in the terms of equality. He says that there's a problem with equality, but I think that the equality. Once you analyze what it means, once you analyze what BEE means, what employment equity means, it means that there is no room in this country within that ideological framework of political preference for a family-owned business with 50 or more employees that can be run by the family. It has to be ownership has to be transferred to black people, a majority ownership, and the majority of employees and management and so on has to be black. This is the policy of the South African government. And so that seems to be a clear political preference. So I think he's sincere in that preference, and whether we like it or not, I don't think he doesn't think of it as evil. He just thinks that is justice, and he thinks maybe he calls it equality, but in fact it is to construct a neopolitical dominant economy as the same way the political space is reflected. Then the second reason why I think he's sincere is that he does not understand that BE is economically harmful. It requires an economic understanding. And good economics is not equally distributed in society. Certainly Mr. Ramaphosa is, among many other world leaders, have shortcomings in his understanding of economics. In this case, it's very severe. And he sincerely seems to believe that it's best if ownership is spread equally through any society, and that will lead to growth. It's actually the opposite all through history. Some people are good at being stewards of capital, and other people are better at being employees. I'm an employee. I'm not a steward of capital, a little bit that I've built up over time, but some people, like very successful industrialists, have proven themselves to sort of refrain from consuming everything they own. They actually leave everything in production structure, and that helps society. But that's an economic understanding. If you don't understand it or don't agree with that analysis, then you can go down a bad path. So I'm afraid he's unfortunately, his analysis is wrong. And then thirdly, I don't think this is so much the case with Mr. Ramaphosa, but I think many people around the patronage network still wants to benefit from BEE. And it's easier to benefit through the political system for many people than it is through the entrepreneurial value-adding system. And so there's unfortunately very much pressure at low level and high level within the ANC still for sectional interests, people who want to grow rich and think that it's all right for them to do so through political means. Mr. Ramaphosa has become fabulously rich already in the 1990s, so I think it's not at this stage a big thing for him anymore. But those are the three reasons why I think BE has staying power, why Mr. Ramaphosa has come to double down, and why that doubling down is finding favor within his party and is likely to remain there, and it will only become less through strong opposition. It won't dissipate by itself.
Yeah, I think that's one of the mistakes that I think organized business has made over the last several decades, is to assume that, to use the phrase of Winston Churchill, that if you feed the crocodile, you hope that he will eat you last. To take the mining industry as an example, originally when the mining charter was introduced and the MPRDA legislation came in the early 2000s, the BEE targets there were actually just aspirational. The code didn't set any binding obligations on the industry, and I think in good faith the industry said, well, we want to move towards a certain amount of black ownership and more inclusion and so on. And then not very soon afterwards, through various amendments and changes, Mining Charter 2 and 3, now suddenly there were these very onerous binding targets. And for example, even when you are deemed empowered, you can no longer slip back down beyond that threshold. Now you have to, you can't seed equity, you can't resell on. So that further constrains the economy. Another example, I think, is Starlink. To me, the benefits for, and I'm sure this would be mostly poor black rural South Africans who would actually benefit from Starlink, not to mention the farming community that are often isolated and could benefit from high-speed internet. The fact that the government refuses to allow Starlink to operate in this country because it doesn't meet the BE requirements, I think really highlights just how perverse this policy is. This is not about improving opportunities for black people. This is about enriching a narrow elite. So I think that's a very illustrative example.
What's happened to Starlink is striking because it's such a prominent company international, and Mr. Musk has his flair and tweets about it. but just multiply that by 1 million times, and that is the effect that is actually happening every day in South Africa through companies of much smaller scale with much less flashy products, but also of value-adding capacity, which are now prohibited, restricted. So I'm afraid that, it's indicative what's happened to Mr. Musk. And interestingly, there seems to be some possibility that he may be offered, he and others like him may be offered what is called equity equivalence. That basically means instead of giving off ownership, you can pay for entry into the country in another way. You can just pay in cash or in some alternative kind of expense. I don't like that very much. I think that has actually been the case for many international companies, many prominent brands of automakers, of soft drinks and so on have made equity equivalent deals with the government, with Ibrahim Patel, with trade and industry over the last 10 years.
Often their shareholder agreements prohibit them from ceding equity to local partners,
Precisely.
for example.
Yeah, precisely. And so equity equivalence isn't a new thing. It's actually also not a great alternative. I would really like it if some of these international companies would push back also against equity equivalence, because it's still an entry tax. And now with these transformation funds being set up all around, even Mr. John Steenhuisen has signed off on some things explicitly called transformation funds. He didn't, perfect that he wasn't the first to establish them, but he continued his predecessor's policies. So even within this, the government, there's lots of staying power for these transformation funds. Minister Parks, Tower of Trade and Industry, now wants to put a near 100 billion rand fund there. We have some localization funds, and I'm just seeing a scenario in which these equity equivalent schemes are being directed to fund these slush funds, and that creates a whole new separate patronage network that will take another 10, 20 years to disentangle. So these equity equivalent alternatives are a problem. I hope they don't stay.
Yeah, and I think underpinning something like an equivalence scheme is an assumption that somehow the world, investors, owes us something for operating here. But we should be welcoming that investment as a net benefit to ourselves.
Yeah, but again, some of it is economic misunderstanding. It's the idea that if you let Starlink provide satellite communication in the country, that's going to be a problem. Why would they have people are going to be better off with it regardless, and now they have to pay that entry tax. So it's the misunderstanding, but then also the once there's this little small what's it called, a trechter, anyways, where a lot of like a choke point. So BE and these entry requirements, they form a choke point, and wherever there's this choke point, people can make money off the side.
And I think your point about the hundreds, if not thousands, of other companies that are either operating at a low capacity or are not choosing to operate in South Africa at all because of these costs. I think there is a massive opportunity cost that you just don't see. It's invisible.
Yeah, choosing not to expand, choosing not to employ. If you have 49 employees today, you'd be very hesitant to employ the 50th employee. Or even if you're at 45, you're going to think twice about getting near that 50 mark, because government's going to bring that 50 mark employment equity threshold down. In Namibia, the employment equity threshold is now 10. So this is in so many ways so damaging.
But yeah, I think that's a good example. When you concede the point, when you concede the principle, then the government can very easily change those thresholds.
Right.
And when you resist, well, they say, well, you already accept 50, why not accept 40 or even 10?
Yes.
But, you mentioned earlier some of the strands of thinking. The kind of racial nationalism, I think, is the one impulse within the government, and the ANC's ideology, and we're having a separate conversation with Dr. Anthea Jeffrey about the National Democratic Revolution, this socialist paradigm that really underpins ANC policy. But then there's also socialism. Yeah, so a racial nationalist socialism, I think, is probably the best descriptor here. So, is it the case that the president and his colleagues misunderstand economics, or do they have an alternative view of economics which is anathema to free markets and private enterprise and individual liberty?
Even in his remarks last week or two ago, President Ramaphosa used the term the means of production, and used several typically socialist or Marxist economic thinking phrases. So I think there's a serious conviction of that theory of economics, insofar as you can call it a theory. It has its problems. So you can sincerely be wrong. And I think, unfortunately, some of what we see from the ANC is sincerely just wrong economics. Much of it isn't. This does not explain it, but much of it is just sincerely wrong. And all through, I mean, especially in the 90s and past 20 years, you know, today we can be very explicitly against BEE. We can say it's harmful. Professor Gomede says it's harmful. Some very successful black business people have said that it is harmful. But 20 years ago, this wasn't easy to say. Even 10 years ago, it was difficult to have these conversations. And I'm afraid that part of why people and business people in South Africa have tolerated BEE and employment equity for so long is that they're good at business, but being good at business doesn't mean you have an elaborate understanding of economic theory and you think about all the concatenating effects on the capital structure and so on. So I think it's only now emerging just how wrong the whole theory of support for BEE was. And that's a good thing, because it means that the opposition can also be strengthened, knowing that we have an correct understanding of economics, and that this is not about an ideological preference. It's about an analytical correctness or not.
All right, so I'd like to discuss strategies for pushing back against some of these hostile government actions like BEE, like expropriation risk, for example, principles like, or proposals like national health insurance. These are potentially systemic level risks for the country and for the economy. Your organization, Sakeliga, has been very active in the courts.
Yes.
You're proponents of scalable solutions to state failure, so you're also building alternative structures, working very closely with business chambers, particularly in some of these failing hinterland towns across the country. So I think that's very important. You're also piloting private mediation and dispute resolution mechanisms to bypass the clogged courts. Security initiatives, the N3, I'm not sure how up to date I am on that, but you know, there are areas in which the domain of the state, which was traditionally the domain of the state, is collapsed, and in other areas the state is actively hostile. So that's quite a toxic mix. So I'd like to just start with litigation. I mean, you have quite a successful track record as an organization, about an 80% success rate.
Even higher, but it's
Okay.
yeah, we almost never lose, yes, so far.
And yeah, it seems that a lot of your energy and resources are going into litigation. So what informs that, and what are some of the limits of that strategy as well?
Yes. Litigation is a very useful and important strategy for containing harmful state interventions. It's also useful for legitimizing and creating alternatives to state failure. Because what we're seeing in South Africa is you have harmful interventions, but you also have collapsing state functions. And this leaves vacuums of order. And you can improve on that by prohibiting using the courts to restrict government interventions that are harmful, that are unjust, for example, BEE or employment equity or the NHI, or for example, Eskom cutting off towns' power and so on. So you can use the courts to restrict the harmful interventions. But then you can also use the courts to, I think, legitimize and present to the court alternatives that it can lend its credence to, lend its agreement to, that it can give its stamp of approval. Because, for example, in small town South Africa, it's unlikely that the state will find ways to make these towns recover at a municipal level. And so we think that many of these towns won't recover and they face a dire few decades. But in many of these places, we think that there is enough capital and energy within the business sector, and we think that they can find ways to take over some of the infrastructure maintenance, some of the service delivery, some of the administration of town administration that you have to have in a town, that they can do that on a profit or a non-profit basis. But doing that isn't easy because you have disputes over jurisdiction. And this is where the courts are an important mechanism for resolving disputes with the state on what is good for society. And that doesn't solve all problems. Many people have become disillusioned with the courts. They think that there are not much to be gained through court cases. They look at the Kill the Boer judgment, where the court appears to have said, well, you can sing Kill the Boer, that's fine. We would caution first against too high expectations of litigation. The courts cannot achieve the impossible, nor will the courts always be right. But in many cases where the state has harmful interventions, or where an area of state failure is so extensive that alternative solutions need to be given credibility by the court, then courts are a valuable litigation. We're currently litigating about 6 cases, and we aim to double that by the end of the year concurrent. And then we have a great track record behind us, and we see still a lot of scope for litigation in the next few years to create a better economic environment in the public interest.
All right, and my understanding is you're also preparing a court challenge against the Employment Equity Amendment Act.
Indeed, we're working with our partners. In this case will be NIASA, the National Employers Association of South Africa. That's Gerard Papenfuss and his team. And many companies have come forward, provided affidavits explaining why this would be impossible. The Employment Equity Act is actually interesting because these regulations we think are impossible to comply with. And that makes for interesting litigation because courts would... It's hard for courts not to have sympathy with people who are required to do the impossible. And so we're actually optimistic about the Employment Equity regulations. So upcoming cases for us is Employment Equity, Expropriation Act, NHI, several areas of BEE. We're seeing a massive expansion in many industries. And yeah, those are some of the main cases we'll be taking on this year.
All right, well, strength to your arm. And yeah, I think it's extraordinary the role that civil society actors, business organizations like yours, play in resisting some of these more harmful edicts from the state. And I think that people who believe in the cause that you're fighting for should definitely commit their resources and their support. So I just wanted to kind of test out this idea of litigation, because I mean, you mentioned the Kill the Boer case, and not only did the High Court, sitting as the Equality Court, and the Supreme Court of Appeal deem the song to be permissible, but the Constitutional Court didn't even deem it appropriate to hear the case before that court, which I think was very worrying, not only for the legal profession but also for South Africans in general. So, you know, in some respects, and your colleague Professor Koos Malan has written extensively on this, transformania, the idea of transformationism, has taken very firm root within the judiciary. So the Judicial Services Commission, which is supposed to be this multilateral forum for legal practitioners and state representatives to elect members of the judiciary, that seems to have become a very active site of contestation. You have people like Julius Malema deciding who is going to become a judge, and then shortly thereafter is heard by the very same judges. I'm not sure if that's factually correct, but the point is that this has become highly politicized. And so is it reasonable to assume that this very same judiciary is going to be sympathetic when it comes to really the core ideological tenets of the current political dispensation, this idea of black economic empowerment? Maybe you can challenge it at the margins by saying this is not implementable or these rules are too onerous, but is the court really going to be bold enough to challenge, to throw out the Black Economic Empowerment Act, for example?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for Professor Koos Malan's analysis of why courts are, not only in South Africa, but internationally, always restrained in the extent to which they can find against the dominant political establishment, the core tenets of that establishment. And taking that into account, we will not we're very unlikely to ask the court to set aside BE as a whole, not because we don't think it should be set aside, but just because that would probably be too much against the core tenets, and it would, I think, litigation that puts a court in too much of a direct confrontation with another domain of the state, which is the legislature or the executive. You know, in sort of standard political theory, they're all independent, but they're not really independent, not in South Africa, not elsewhere. They're always connected, like you said, the one appoints the other and so on. So I think one must not have unrealistic expectations of the court, and rather use them for the extensive yet limited areas of where they can have influence. And so we at least craft our litigation to be solutions driven. We try and present the court with evidence of real economic harm, and with ways to find that there is a better alternative, or that something is unacceptable, with the public interest in mind. And that's served us well so far. At some point, maybe that does not work. It depends on many things. But for now, I think that there's still much left to be gained from prudent litigation that sees the court not as an enemy, but just as an entity that also really wants to look after the public interest within certain constraints, and try and present it with workable legal arguments and workable legal pleas.
Yeah, I think also the point that you made around ultimately the state having dominion over all of the different spheres of government. Politics 101, you would see these checks and balances, these different separations of powers. But ultimately, a lot of those institutions are operating within the slipstream of the dominant political elite.
Yes, I would say that our challenge in the next decade in South Africa is to redefine the role of the state. It's not the only strategy for change. There are some strategies that concentrate on education, for example. Much of philanthropic money in South Africa goes into changing and providing better education beyond the state's constraints and bad education.
Valuable.
That's an understandable strategy for change. The idea is education leading to better voting patterns, better economic growth, and so on. Another strategy could be voting and trying to change the executive, the government, through the legislature. And that's not been a successful strategy in the past 30 years in South Africa. And the experiment right now with the DA in the previous official opposition now, with working with the ANC in government, is not fabulously successful, to put it mildly. They're constrained, I understand that, but there are serious problems there. So our strategy, and I think what is a good business strategy, if you want to have a diverse strategy for solving problems in South Africa, would be, let's try, and whoever is in power, and whatever the education levels in society, let's try to redefine the role of the state. We've let the state, not only in South Africa, but internationally, but also here, grow enormously powerful, really beyond what is acceptable. It extends itself into the spheres of private life and to the spheres of private business in ways that are totally unacceptable. It extends its way into communal life, of cultural and communities that are totally unacceptable. So maybe part of the mission is actually just to redefine what it can do. And that cannot be done from within the state. That has to be done from outside. And that is why I think what a successful South Africa could look like is one where other entities in society, from business side, from religion side, from cultural side, where other entities are strong enough to actually say no, and where we have popularized an alternative ethic about what it means to do good and just business, to do maximum appropriate non-compliance where it's possible, to not use the ANC-led government's terminology like transformation and empowerment as if these are self-explanatory, but actually see them for party political preferences and think outside of that box. It's not an easy mission, but that's the one we're interested in. And our mission is to, we think that we have to make sure that business is independent enough of the state to actually counterbalance these harmful interventions and what is leading to state failure at scale in South Africa.
Yeah, I think that term independence is so important. You don't necessarily need to wait for the government to take the lead.
Yes.
You have responsibilities to your own community, to the shareholders in your business, to the employees in your business.
Yes.
You don't necessarily have to abide by harmful government regulations and policies. But many people would ask, well, am I not exposing myself to risk? What are the limits of this MAN strategy, the maximum appropriate non-compliance? do you not then get into the realm of recklessness, or is this principled civil disobedience that we're talking about?
There's always for proper conduct, for wise judgment, you always have to apply judgment. Well, oordeel. You have to apply judgment. So it would be unwise, I think, to just say I'm going to do non-compliance with any law in South Africa because they're all unjust, or even I'm going to decide these laws are all unjust and I'm just never going to comply regardless of the consequences. You could, of course, do that, but there are maybe the consequences are too high. For example, you could lose your business and put 50 or 100 or 1,000 people out of work, or you could end up in jail. And I think an appropriate response is to judge to develop a kind of strategy that is appropriate to your circumstances, your willingness to test the threshold, your willingness to test the limits, about how far you're willing to push back. And we've, I think, for too long been in a world where we rely on compliance advisors who tell us how to comply. And we should try and switch that around and get our compliance advisors to tell us, help us understand how little can we comply with something that is harmful and still balance the risks that present themselves. And this is not because the South African government currently is uniquely doing harmful things. They're doing very harmful things, but all through society, states have sometimes done very harmful things. In the 1980s, for example, it was very popular, the Sullivan Principles, through which it was one of the most well-known mechanisms by which many international companies subscribe to an alternative ethic about how they will employ people and how they will appoint people, regardless of the South African government of the time's racial restrictions. And you could say that they were testing the limits there. They were doing some kind of non-compliance. They were developing and ascribing to an alternative ethic. So in the end, I don't think all the change we're going to need would come from something like the courts. Ending BEE, I think, ultimately will come from developing a greater threshold and ability to push back against it, and in the end, stop complying with it. It just becomes lapsed law. It does not have effect anymore. Maybe something like e-tolls in the end. But that we're somewhere years off from that. But right now we're in, I think, a hopeful phase where people are getting a little bit firmer and thinking, I'm going to push back as far as I can. And in fact, because some of this is impossible and immoral, and that means my scope for developing alternatives is just much higher. So yeah, it's hopeful times, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And as you were speaking about the Sullivan Principles, I was just reflecting on Roger Crawford, who passed away earlier this year. And I think he really was the personal embodiment of this philosophy of that you have a responsibility to push back against harmful government policies, and he was a great pioneer of the Sullivan Principles domestically with his work with Johnson & Johnson.
Yes.
And yeah, I think his death and now this heightened scrutiny on the relationship commercially and diplomatically between the United States and South Africa, I think that's very, very interesting, a parallel, if you will.
I became aware of the Sullivan Principles through Roger. He, shortly after my appointment a few years ago, he suggested we meet. We had met by then, and he relayed to me much of the work he had done on the Sullivan Principles, and he was very hopeful in that conversation that some alternative ethic like that could develop again. And I think we're in the early days of that, which I have fond memories of Roger. Met him on several occasions, and that's a very good moment to remember him in this conversation. Yes.
Yeah, he was a great mentor of mine as well. But in the library of the Free Market Foundation upstairs, we have a portrait of Friedrich Hayek, the great Austrian economist. And he spoke about the difference between law and legislation. Yes. And, I think that's a very interesting paradigm with which to look at the situation in South Africa, because we have all of these laws, and you could drive yourself to ruin by following all of these laws. And I think what we're trying to encourage people is to appeal to a higher order. I mean,
yes.
Professor Milan speaks about constitutionalism. which is not solely rooted in the document that we call the Constitution. It's a set of higher legal principles and an ethic. Do you want to expand on that concept?
I think that much like we can sometimes see in the debasement of money leading to monetary chaos, when governments print too much money, you have debasement of money, you have monetary chaos, economic chaos. So in the world of morality and law, you can have debasement of the concept of law. When you have a multiplication of laws, a proliferation of laws, but actually they are more properly called legislation. They are documents of man. They do not necessarily agree to a higher principle. They are a codification of a preference, which is much of what we see today, a racial preference, a political dominance preference, or an ideological preference. Even the preference for equality, you could say, is a legislative preference. And as that proliferates, and we are sitting today in a debasement of law environment. And I think part of the moral challenge we have as businesses, as citizens, as burghers of our communities and of society, would be to just always remember that just because the government is debasing law by a preponderance of harmful legislation doesn't mean that all law and order becomes questionable. And so it complicates things, but there is I think an enhanced role for moral thinkers, religious thinkers, to try and remind us in these times of a legal debasement of what actually, regardless of what the law says, is important and isn't, what is just and what is not. And there is a risk that people become less law-abiding, and I mean that in the bad sense. Because of this debasement. So I think we must just be wary, and I like that you bring Hayek up because of his law legislation distinction. We should remember, while these legislations, this legislation is so harmful, let's try and stick and remember that some laws actually do have weight, and we must not lose them out of sight.
Yeah, we at the Free Market Foundation sadly lost another giant, Rex van Schalkwyk, who was a retired judge and who was the chairperson of the Free Market Foundation. And he was a passionate advocate of the rule of law. And he always reminded us that the rule of law kind of transcends the institutional arrangements or the personnel that happen to occupy the judiciary. And I think this idea of equality before law, I think, is something very important. And we often talk about equality in the socioeconomic sense. But I think equality at law is something that, as South Africans, we need to be reminded of.
Yeah.
All right. So, I just wanted to double click on this idea of reimagining the state. So, we obviously have this paradoxical condition where the state is failing to uphold basic security, for example, like highway robbery on the N3 or the rampant criminality, whether it's the Cape Flats or the CBD of Joburg, but at the same time is expanding its reach and interfering in the daily lives of ordinary South Africans. So how do we go about this daunting process of reimagining, restructuring the state? One principle that we are quite vocal on is political decentralization and federalism. We have many federal characteristics in our constitution, but federalism seems to have been something that we as South Africans have lost sight of. What would you like to add to this conversation about how we restructure the state?
Well, it does need to be a one grand project. Changing the scope of the state can often just be initiatives that you don't need the whole state to agree with. For example, I think there is much that provinces like the Western Cape or even towns under non-ANC control or non-ANC coalitions can do. For example, they can just send envoys or develop their own diplomatic relations. That doesn't mean that it'll be respected or recognized at the same level as the state, but why not just, I think do whatever you think is necessary until you are challenged. So I think more and more adventurism, even from within these spheres in this quasi-federal state structure, should be welcomed. There's scope there. Then the other way of creating a decentralized, you can also call it a balanced society, is probably ironically through filling the vacuums of state failure. This makes South Africa an interesting sandbox for the West, even if you will, for I think other parts of the world will at some point go through the same challenges, but where so much power is concentrated in the state, and then that state loses its executive capability. You have other strong states in the world, like in the United States or other European states, are very strong, but they haven't lost their executive capability to the same extent the South African one has. And yet, here you still have a strong enough capital base, a strong enough civil society that you can potentially fill these gaps of state failure, these vacuums that develop. I think most prominently, for example, at local level in towns across South Africa. I think that we are going to see a de facto development in some regions in South Africa and in some towns of alternative administration of these towns, not because not born out of a fight, winning a power struggle with the old municipality, but just because the old municipality collapsed and because there was a vacuum, and then enough of the business people in that town and enough of the citizens got together and formed alternative structures. Maybe it's one, maybe it's two, maybe it's three. There'll be an emergent order in some of these towns, and I think that is to me some of the most beautiful ways of decentralization. It is filling a vacuum without an outright power struggle, and ironically, I think that's going to be easier in South Africa than elsewhere in the world to redraw what it means to have a balanced society. That's at the micro level. At the macro level, I think entities like Sakeliga, in our case, we try to be a counterbalance to harmful state intervention through our combination of litigation, but also through these, what we call alternative structures. Just thinking, what if the state didn't exist? What if it didn't exist? What would businesses need to provide in a coordinated fashion on maybe a non-profit basis or a profit basis, doesn't matter, but what kind of market institutions do we need to develop? Maybe we need to develop a security project on the N3 to counter the hijackings there. We're looking into some of that. Maybe we should develop our own trade office to receive foreign trade delegations, or develop friendly relations and improve access, market access elsewhere in the world. That's something we're doing. All of this is nascent, but all of this is very interesting in this South African sandbox. I think it's a unique combination of state failure with strong capital structure still in existence that can actually lead to new life blooming.
Yeah, and privatization is a principle of that as well, right? You know, the profit-seeking initiatives that provide benefit to the public, I think should be embraced. You know.
Yeah, so what you're definitely going to see in some towns, those towns that make it, is privatization, private supply of some water, electricity, some what you call shared infrastructure. The old, usually people would say, what do you need the state for? To provide basic services and security. Well, that's not happening in South Africa, and we're actually seeing companies doing that, and it can be done very profitably on a for-profit basis, you know. But then, of course, the state sees competition and it tries to restrict it, like we're seeing now with some of the security laws and regulations that are being mooted right now in Parliament and by the Minister. And part of what Sakeliga and entities like the Free Market Foundation and others need to do in the next few years is just to contain that impulse from the state to outlaw state replacement by the private sector. So we need to contain that impulse. It's going to be important for towns and people all across the country.
Yeah, and I think what I've taken away from this discussion is that we do need to change the conversation around the nature of the state. It's not just about making the state a bit more lean and efficient, maybe a bit smaller, more cost-effective, reducing the debt. All of those things are important. But it's actually about thinking outside of the state. So, Piet le Roux, I wanted to thank you very much for the work that yourself and your colleagues at Sakeliga are doing. I think you are, in many respects, ahead of the curve. about the challenges that are facing South Africa and some of the solutions that could help us to navigate our way out of the many crises that we're experiencing as a country. So I just wanted to express my gratitude for this conversation today at Northwoods House.
Thank you for having me in this wonderful place. I was here when you opened your offices was it 2 years ago, I think, around then. And I'm glad to see the Free Market Foundation doing well.
Thank you very much.